Welcome to the College Essay Advisors podcast. Before we introduce ourselves, here's a little preview of what's to come.
Any neurodiversity learning disability comes with a strength, whether it's
Absolutely.
autism spectrum disorder or dyslexia. Like there's something
Mhm.
about you that you are going to discover, if you haven't already, that
Mhm.
is an asset to you, even if you have to work through the difficulties.
Welcome to the College Essay Advisors podcast, an ongoing exploration of how to write admissions essays that get you noticed and accepted. My name is Stacey Brooke, and I am the founder and chief advisor at College Essay Advisors.
And my name is Becca Myers, and I am director of advising at College Essay Advisors.
And today we're going to be talking to you about neurodiversity, learning differences, and how to address them in your essays.
Hi, Stacy.
Why? Hi.
maybe maybe
It's
we
been a
should
long
it's been
time.
a while. Maybe we should start by talking about the definition of neurodiversity and learning differences and kind of how they overlap and how they're different.
That sounds amazing.
Okay. So neurodiversity, I don't want to define it in terms of typical atypical. I think of it more as processing information differently, right? And so the term neuro and the term diversity, so thinking about brain, but also thinking about a wide range of processing
Mhm.
and
And
learning.
allowing space for various methods, means, characteristics in terms of how people process versus previous thinking on this, where I think there was maybe like a more standardized, accepted way to think about things, where now I think in modern days people are realizing that we can process things in many different ways, and all of that is totally normal, acceptable, advantageous in different ways.
Yes, although as my therapist tells me, the world is still not completely accommodating
100%.
to
100%.
to
And
neurodiversity.
and that's why a part of the reason we're talking about this is because that is something we need to take into account when we're thinking about, when a student is thinking about addressing this head on in an essay, is how much taboo surrounds this topic still. What do you need to explain about your circumstances, the way that you see the world, the way that your brain works, and whether or not it's something that defines you enough for you to even want to address it at all.
Exactly, because sometimes neurodiversity will feel like a core part of your identity, and other times it might actually have affected in a more subtle way your interests and pursuits. So I'm pretty open about. I'm sorry, guys. I'm fixing my ring light. I'm pretty open about pursuing my own ADHD diagnosis right now as a woman in her mid 40s. I'm pretty sure I had ADHD growing up, but had never really in the 80s there wasn't really a push, at least for women, for girls to have that diagnosis. And so for me, I ended up going into poetry and fields where I was encouraged to think in a more diverse way. So I was thinking back to when I wrote my college essay in the mid 90s. I wouldn't have known to write about neurodiversity, but I did know to write a little bit about creativity because that's sort of how my neurodiversity manifests. So I guess this is my way of saying that you don't have to necessarily talk about an ADHD diagnosis in an essay unless that feels so central to who you are. But you might talk around it, right? You might indicate to your reader that there are ways that you think differently that aren't necessarily reduced down to a diagnosis.
Absolutely. Especially if some of the mechanisms you've developed to help like facilitate or assist the way that you best work are ultimately advantageous generally in life, like systems of organization, systems of creativity, like you're talking about, Becca. I think there are lots of things that we sort of do even unintentionally to help boost our own strengths and skills. So it might be something, your strengths might be reflective of the way that your brain processes the world. Um, and you might not need to put a label on it.
Absolutely. And then some of some students are going to have had accommodations in high school for learning differences, right? So I think of neurodiversity as sort of the umbrella, and many learning differences fall within that. So we think about like dyslexia, or what's another one, like dysgraphia, which I've learned about, which is
Hmm.
difficulty writing or processing words, right? And so maybe as a student you've needed to have some special accommodations for that. Does that necessarily show up in your essay? It might not, because there's room in the application in other areas where you might want to indicate that. But there is that overlap between the learning difference and the neurodiversity.
Hmm. Absolutely. And sometimes, we're giving lots of examples where we're talking a lot about how a learning difference might not show up in an essay, but then there are, of course, instances where maybe that is something that has grounded you, has defined you, has made such an impact, a core impact on your life, that it is worth talking about it. It's possible that someone who, let's say, has dyslexia and maybe relies a little bit more on, because of accommodations, they use their sense of hearing, maybe
Mhm.
that is something that, like, ultimately has enriched their life, enriched their ability to communicate with people, made them a better listener, made them a better musician. Like, how do some of the ways that you interact in the world because of the way you process things, how is that a boon to other areas of your life, and how will it be a strength you can bring, excuse me, to a community full of other students, and that really actually might make you stand out, might be something differentiating about you that's interesting and compelling for an admissions officer.
100%. And I love your focus on the positivity and the strengths. Um, because well, so one of the questions I first ask students when I work with them is, how do you process information? How do you think? How does your brain work? And the reason I've started asking this is because a couple years ago I discovered that I have something called aphantasia, which is, I think it's like 1% of the population. You cannot see pictures in your mind. So I have no images. I have no ability to visualize ever. And I never realized that until recently. I think I was reading an article by um, someone like a CEO at Facebook who wrote an article about it. And I identified with all of it because he used to grow up and people would say, like, can you picture a beach in your head? And he'd be like, I got nothing. Whereas I had friends
Wow.
who'd be like, well, I can almost like see a video. Like my own child can see images and actually like animate them in his head, which makes him really good at math. And for me, I struggled in math in school my whole life and I didn't understand why. It's because I don't visualize. But what I did discover is I'm incredible at metaphor and empathy. And so that's
Hmm.
partly why I became a poet and a writer. So if I were thinking about how to write an essay about that, I wouldn't focus on my lack of aptitude in math. I would focus on my ability to transcend the visual and think in terms of metaphor, right? Whether I was going to go to school
Hmm.
to be an English major or psychology major, I would
Hmm.
focus on the strengths because I really do believe that any neurodiversity learning disability comes with a strength, whether it's
Absolutely.
autism spectrum disorder or dyslexia. Like there's something
Hmm.
about you that you are going to discover, if you haven't already, that
Hmm.
is an asset to you, even if you have to work through the difficulties.
Most definitely. And I also think the ability to self-reflect, to analyze. I mean, what you were just saying about your own ability to turn inward and understand that what other people might take for granted is something that you just, like, couldn't wrap your arms around, and that's such an interesting story and such an interesting observation that I think is the kind of detail that pulls a reader in, and that also showcases a writer's ability to think about the world around them, how they engage with it, how they essentially how they understand their environment and how they adapt, or how I don't know, it's maybe like, what I'm trying to say is it's sort of almost societal, larger societal reflection that is like the next level of storytelling, of understanding of where you fit within a community. So I just think there's something that's interesting and compelling about a student's ability to think about that larger picture. I think we're often asking students to kind of dive into details about their own life, but I do think that that kind of larger observation shows something in terms of empathy, in terms of desire to understand other people, in terms of social skills that is it can be hard to pull off, but I also think it's pretty fascinating when a student is able to do that.
I agree because I think when a lot of students approach the Common App essay, they're thinking in terms of how do I take an extracurricular activity and make it into something versus how do I think about a way of thinking or a way of moving through the world and take and turn it
Absolutely.
into something.
Absolutely.
And just recently working with a student who's dyslexic, I was so fascinated by his ability to visualize three-dimensionally. I think a lot of, well, I won't say a lot, but I know that many students with dyslexia do have that ability to picture things three-dimensionally, even though maybe letters rearrange themselves. So the strength is in the
Mhm.
visualization, which is fascinating
Mhm.
to me. I remember the student and I were talking, and he was telling me that he can actually animate graphs in his head, and I just I didn't even want to talk about
Mm.
the essay anymore. I just wanted to pick his brain about that because the way
Mhm.
we're all so different and the way you can, you know, if we had been cohorts in college, I would have loved to have sat in a class with that person because how different are our
Absolutely.
brains? Like, what can we bring to a group project together? Like, it's incredible.
Completely. And I think we often give the advice to our students of we're trying to help them showcase for admissions what happens inside their head. That's not necessarily always the primary goal, but I think ultimately it really is. You're trying to kind of you're trying to give some slice of your method of thinking or the way that your mind works and lay it out for admissions, be it on an emotional level, on an intellectual level. So this is another opportunity for you to sort of just indicate to admissions like this is the way that I think through a problem. This is the way that I respond emotionally to a thing. And even if it is different than the way that the other people that I know do it, this is why it works for me. And this is why it works in varied situations. And this is why it's an asset to your community.
Absolutely. And particularly, I think students applying for like business school or the majors where you may not think that difference is helpful, but it is because if I mean, I would certainly want a student who's highly creative or thinks differently in a business program, and I think your job on the page is to prove that. And so, as with any essay that you're going to work on with us, we would really advocate for balance. So, if you choose to write
Hmm.
about something like ADHD, you don't want three-fourths of the essay to be about how your school never accommodated you or how you
Hmm.
failed organization in second grade. Yes, that is a true story to me. Um, and your teacher made you clean out your desk in front of everyone.
No,
Yeah, it's okay. I moved on. I moved on.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I'll pay for
So
that therapy session for you if you
yeah.
want.
Oh, I've paid for it. Don't worry. I've paid for it. But you don't, that's the past, right? It's okay to give a
Hmm.
little bit of that background, but you want to move into the ways that you understand yourself, I think, in a positive light. And look, if you're still really struggling with a diagnosis, maybe this is not the place to work through that, right? Because you
Hmm.
do unfortunately this application process is about showing your best self, right? You
Hmm.
can save all of the struggles for therapy. I advocate for I wish we could get a therapy sponsor because I'm so here for it. But I think the essay has to be that 650 word space where you are really trying to like polish and gleam, you want to
Hmm.
show the best self that you possibly
Yeah.
can, even though we're all trying our
Works in
best
works
hard.
in progress
Works
for
in
sure.
progress, yeah.
And that actually brings up a good point about where the struggles related to these diagnoses belong, because there are other opportunities outside of the personal statement, especially if, let's say, a diagnosis comes in high school, it's impacted your grades, it's impacted test scores. I think the instinct for many students is to try to explain that away in the personal statement. And it's actually not the best place to do that. If you, let's say, have accommodations, or if there was a drop in your grades that was so substantial that you feel like it's not representative of what you're capable of, there's an additional information section of 650 words where that might be a more appropriate place to break down the situation, what happened, um, what you think you're capable of, if there was a boost in your grades junior year because you were diagnosed and you had accommodations that actually helped you reach your potential. That's a really straightforward place for you to explain that scenario. The personal statement is really not for that. I think it's a waste of that potentially creative, more expressive space to do that explanation. Instead, um, I think you want to focus on the things that make you shine, your strengths, um, what makes you stand out from other students, and things that you feel generally positive about. And one more thing I wanted to say related to your um your note about emphasizing the positive and making sure the balance of the essay is right. A couple of the personal statement prompts ask about challenges you overcome or failures, and we give the same advice for those prompts that we're going to give for these subjects, which is you just need to make sure that the essay isn't actually predominantly about the challenge or the failure, that it's mostly about the solution, your methods of overcoming, solving problems. What admissions really wants to see ultimately is your change, your growth, your trajectory forward. So if you're experiencing or if you have experienced challenges or hurdles in this arena that you want to discuss, that could very well make for a beautiful essay with impact. You just need to make sure that the balance is right in the essay and that ultimately it feels more positive, more like a showcase of like what you can bring to the table. At the end of the day, what we want to say is, first of all, we love diverse brains. We love varied modes of thinking. We believe admissions, whether they know it or not, really love this too. I don't know how directly they're thinking about this, but I think if you can honestly, effectively, with feeling and a sense of reflection, deliver to admissions a sense of like what's going on inside your brain, um, I think that that can be a really effective way for you to communicate what you bring to a community, who you are, what makes you tick. So, depending on the circumstances and the execution, obviously, in many circumstances, I think you really can write about, whether directly or in some more subtle way, about neurodiversity and learning differences.
That's our episode for today. Thank you so much for listening or watching. If you like our content, please like and subscribe to follow us for more. Happy writing!